My name is Haley. I'm 28 years old, and I thought I knew what betrayal looked like until I walked into my own beach house to find my entire family had moved in without asking. Picture this. I'm standing in my grandmother's sanctuary, keys shaking in my trembling hands, staring at their belongings scattered across every surface like they own the place. My sister Chelsea smirked from the kitchen counter, coffee mug in hand, and delivered the words that shattered my world. Surprise, sis, we decided to make this our family vacation home. That's when I realized this wasn't some spontaneous invasion. This was planned. Before we dive into this unbelievable story of family betrayal and property theft, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're ready to hear how I fought back against my own family's manipulation, hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking family drama stories. Trust me, you won't believe what happens next. To understand how we got here, I need to take you back 6 months to when my beloved grandmother Margaret passed away and left me her oceanfront property in Maine. This wasn't just any house. This was my sanctuary, the place where I spent every summer healing from a childhood filled with neglect while my siblings Chelsea and Derek got all the attention from our parents Richard and Diane. Grandmother Margaret saw how I was treated differently, how I was always the afterthought in family gatherings, the one who had to earn love while my siblings received it freely. The reading of the will was like dropping a bomb in our family gathering. When the lawyer announced that the beach house was mine alone, the temperature in the room plummeted. Richard's face turned red with indignation, while Diane clutched her pearls dramatically. Chelsea's jaw dropped so hard I thought it might hit the floor, and Derek just stared with those cold, calculating eyes that I'd learned to fear growing up. "This is ridiculous," Chelsea spat, her voice dripping with venom. Grandmother was clearly manipulated. "We should contest this will immediately." Derek nodded in agreement, his contractor's hands already clenched into fists. "Haley doesn't deserve the whole property. She barely visited compared to us." The lies rolled off their tongues so easily. They conveniently forgot that I was the one who drove 4 hours every weekend to care for grandmother during her final months, while they only showed up for holidays. But it was my stepmother Brenda who delivered the most theatrical performance. She'd married my father 3 years earlier and immediately positioned herself as the family peacekeeper, though I saw right through her manipulative tactics. Now, she cooed with fake concern, dabbing at non-existent tears with her designer handkerchief. Surely grandmother would have wanted the family to stay united. "Haley, honey, you must understand how this looks. Keeping such a valuable property all to yourself seems so selfish." The family meeting they organized 2 weeks later felt more like an intervention. They'd chosen our childhood dining room, knowing it would trigger memories of every time I'd been made to feel like an outsider. Richard sat at the head of the table like some patriarch delivering judgment, while Diane positioned herself strategically to look wounded and disappointed. Chelsea had prepared a folder of documents, trying to present some legal argument about family property rights that held no water. "We've talked to a lawyer," Richard announced with authority he didn't possess, "and we believe you should sign over partial ownership for fairness. The house is too valuable for one person to control." His voice carried that familiar tone of condescension that had dominated my childhood. Your grandmother clearly wasn't thinking straight in her final months. I sat there listening to them dismantle the woman who'd shown me more love than my own parents ever had. They called her confused, manipulated, even suggested I'd somehow coerced her into changing her will. The cruelty of their words cut deep, but what hurt more was realizing they'd planned this assault together, probably discussing strategies behind my back for weeks. Chelsea leaned forward with that smirk I'd learned to hate, her manicured nails drumming on the table. "You always were Grandma's spoiled favorite, weren't you? Getting special treatment, private conversations, all those extra gifts. Now we see what that favoritism bought you." The accusation hung in the air like poison. "But family means sharing, Haley. You can't just hoard something this valuable while the rest of us struggle." Derek's support came in the form of silent intimidation. He didn't need to speak much. His presence alone was threatening. Growing up, he'd been the golden boy who could do no wrong, the athlete who got college scholarships while I worked 3 jobs to pay for community college. Now he sat there with his arms crossed, backing our parents with his imposing silence. But Brenda's manipulation was the most insidious. She'd perfected the art of emotional blackmail, speaking in soft, concerned tones that made her sound reasonable while delivering devastating blows. "I just worry about what this will do to our family relationships," she whispered, reaching across the table as if to touch my hand. "Money and property have torn apart so many families. Is this house really worth losing all of us?" When I finally found my voice, it came out stronger than I expected. Grandmother left me the house because she knew I was the only one who truly cared about her, not what she could give me. "I'm not signing anything." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face grew darker, Diane's mouth fell open in shock, and Chelsea's eyes flashed with pure rage. "Fine," Chelsea hissed, standing up so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. "But don't expect us to just accept this. Family looks out for family, and if you won't do the right thing voluntarily, maybe we'll have to explore other options." The threat was clear, though I couldn't imagine what those options might be. Derek stood with her, towering over the table with an expression that promised this conversation was far from over. As I drove away from that toxic family meeting, my hands were still shaking on the steering wheel. I'd stood my ground, but something in Chelsea's parting words made my stomach churn with anxiety. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment they decided to stop asking for my cooperation and start taking what they wanted by force. Walking into my beach house that Friday evening in October, I knew something was wrong before I even saw the evidence. The spare key I'd hidden under the decorative lobster statue was gone, and there were fresh tire tracks in the gravel driveway that definitely weren't mine. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered inside. My grandmother's antique furniture had been rearranged to accommodate new belongings that clearly didn't belong there. Chelsea's designer purses sat on the kitchen counter next to Derek's power tools. Diane's prescription bottles lined the bathroom medicine cabinet, and Richard's golf clubs leaned against the living room wall like he'd been planning to use them for weeks. The systematic nature of their invasion became clear as I explored further. They hadn't just moved in, they'd completely taken over. The utilities had been switched to Derek's name, with official paperwork showing a change of address dated 3 weeks earlier. My grandmother's landline had been disconnected and replaced with a new number that I didn't recognize. Even the internet password had been changed, forcing me to use my phone's data to start investigating what had happened. In the kitchen junk drawer, I found the smoking gun, copies of my spare keys, clearly made from impressions or duplicates. There were 3 sets, suggesting they'd been planning this invasion for months. Attached to one keyring was a receipt from a locksmith dated back to August, just weeks after grandmother's funeral. They'd been plotting this takeover while I was still grieving. But the most disturbing discovery was a folder hidden in Derek's toolbox that contained what looked like official legal documents. Upon closer inspection, I realized they were sophisticated forgeries designed to look like emergency housing authorizations and family property agreements. The documents claimed that Richard and Diane needed temporary housing due to unforeseen financial hardship, and that Derek required access to the property for essential family business purposes. One document particularly caught my attention, a forged letter supposedly from me, dated just last week, giving my family permission to stay at the house indefinitely while family matters are resolved. My signature had been copied from somewhere, probably old birthday cards or Christmas gifts, and pasted onto official-looking letterhead. The level of premeditation was staggering. I called our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived next door for 40 years and had always kept an eye on grandmother's property. Her voice wavered with confusion when I asked about recent activity at the house. "Oh, Haley dear, your sister Chelsea stopped by about a month ago." Such a sweet girl, she was so worried about the house sitting empty. She asked about the security codes for the mailbox and utility access, said you'd sent her to check on things. My blood ran cold as Mrs. Patterson continued. She seemed so concerned about break-ins and property damage. She even had official-looking papers showing she was authorized to access the property. I felt so sorry for her, having to take care of family business while you were dealing with grief. Chelsea had manipulated this kind, trusting woman into providing information that enabled their systematic takeover. The trail of deception went deeper than I'd imagined. Derek had used his contractor connections to change not just the locks, but the entire security system. New cameras had been installed that transmitted to devices I didn't control, and motion sensors had been repositioned to monitor areas differently. He'd essentially turned my own security system against me, making me the intruder in my own property. Phone records I later obtained through legal channels revealed dozens of calls between family members and various utility companies, all using fabricated stories about emergency housing situations and temporary family arrangements. They'd painted themselves as displaced relatives in need of shelter, preying on customer service representatives' sympathy to manipulate account changes. The most infuriating part was discovering they'd been planning this invasion since before grandmother's body was even buried. Text messages between Chelsea and Derek, which I later obtained through legal discovery, showed them discussing contingency plans if I refused to share the property voluntarily. Chelsea had written, "Don't worry, little brother. If Princess Haley wants to be selfish, we'll just take what should have been ours anyway." Richard had been the strategic mastermind, using his experience in business negotiations to coordinate their campaign. He'd researched property laws, looking for loopholes they could exploit, and had even consulted with a shady lawyer about adverse possession claims. His notes, which I found in his briefcase, outlined a timeline for establishing residency that would strengthen any legal challenges they might face. Diane's role had been to provide emotional cover for their scheme. She'd been calling extended family members for weeks, spinning a narrative about my greed and disrespect for family values. These relatives, who barely knew the real situation, had been primed to support whatever action my parents decided to take. Diane had created an echo chamber of family pressure designed to make me feel isolated and guilty. But Brenda's involvement was perhaps the most calculated. She'd been documenting everything, taking photos and keeping records that could be used to support false claims about their legitimate residence at the property. Her Instagram posts from the previous month showed subtle hints of being at a family beach house, carefully crafted to establish a social media presence that suggested ongoing residence. As I stood in my violated sanctuary, surrounded by evidence of their elaborate betrayal, I realized this wasn't just about the property. This was about power, control, and their determination to punish me for refusing to submit to their demands. They'd turned my inheritance into a weapon, my grief into vulnerability they could exploit. The folder I discovered in Derek's toolbox contained one final, chilling document, a timeline for Phase 2 of their operation, which apparently involved filing legal challenges to my ownership and establishing permanent residency claims. They'd planned to present me with a fait accompli, forcing me to accept their presence or face a prolonged legal battle they believed I couldn't afford or sustain. Standing there in my grandmother's kitchen, holding evidence of their systematic betrayal, I felt something shift inside me. The shock was giving way to cold, determined anger. They'd declared war on my inheritance, my memories, and my future. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated my determination to protect what grandmother had entrusted to me. The next morning brought an escalation I never could have anticipated. I woke up in my apartment to find 3 missed calls from Detective Morrison of the local police department and a voicemail that made my blood run cold. "Ms. Haley, we need you to come in for questioning regarding allegations of elder abuse and document forgery related to your grandmother's estate." Brenda had struck first and struck hard. She'd filed official police reports claiming I had psychologically manipulated grandmother Margaret during her final months, coercing her into changing her will through isolation and emotional blackmail. The reports painted me as a predatory granddaughter who'd exploited an elderly woman's vulnerability for financial gain. Even more devastating, she'd somehow obtained documentation suggesting the will itself might be fraudulent. At the police station, Detective Morrison laid out a file thick with allegations. Someone had provided what appeared to be evidence of my suspicious behavior around the time of grandmother's will change. There were photos of me visiting her house frequently, which they'd characterized as evidence of undue influence rather than loving care. They'd even found witnesses, probably paid or manipulated, who claimed to have observed me arguing with grandmother about money. We also have reports that you've been threatening your family members, Detective Morrison continued, sliding another document across the table. Your stepmother filed a complaint yesterday claiming you've been harassing them since they moved into what they describe as family property. I stared at the report in disbelief. Brenda had twisted every phone call I'd made trying to understand their invasion into evidence of intimidation and threats. But they weren't finished. Derek had used his construction connections to systematically sabotage the property's infrastructure. The water pressure had been mysteriously reduced, the electrical system was experiencing random outages, and the heating system had developed problems that would require expensive repairs. When I called service companies, they told me that the property owner, Derek Williams, had already scheduled repairs and changes that I'd apparently authorized. The security system he'd installed wasn't just monitoring the property, it was gathering evidence to support their false narratives. Cameras positioned to catch me entering their residence, audio recordings that could be edited to make my words sound threatening, and motion sensors that documented every minute of my presence as if I were the intruder. Chelsea had turned to social media warfare with the skill of a professional propagandist. Her Facebook posts painted a heartbreaking picture of a family displaced by my greed. It breaks my heart that grief has changed my sister so much, she wrote in a post that garnered hundreds of sympathetic comments. Our grandmother always wanted the family to stay close, but Haley has chosen money over family bonds. Please keep us in your thoughts as we navigate this difficult situation. The posts were carefully crafted to generate maximum sympathy, while avoiding any direct accusations that could be considered defamatory. She shared old family photos from gatherings at the beach house, captioned with wistful remembrances of happier times when we were all welcome in Grandma's home. The implication was clear: I had broken up a loving family over property disputes. But the most devastating blow came when extended family members began arriving unannounced. Cousin Tyler, whom I'd barely spoken to since childhood, pulled into the driveway with a massive moving truck and began unloading furniture like he'd been given permanent residence. When I confronted him, he produced a letter supposedly from me welcoming him to stay as long as needed during these difficult family times. Haley, I appreciate you letting me crash here while I get back on my feet, Tyler said with apparent sincerity, clearly believing the fabricated story he'd been told. Chelsea explained how you wanted to help family members who are struggling. It means a lot, especially after losing Grandma. He'd been completely manipulated into believing I'd offered housing, and arguing with him would only make me look like I was going back on my word. More relatives followed throughout the week. Uncle Robert arrived with his wife and 2 teenage children, having been told there was plenty of room for their family vacation that I'd supposedly approved. Aunt Susan brought her elderly mother, claiming I'd offered respite care in the family beach house. Each arrival came with forged documentation or manipulated conversations that made me appear either generous or unstable, depending on how I reacted to their presence. The family lawyer Richard had hired was a shark named Morton Vance who specialized in property disputes and had a reputation for winning through intimidation rather than legitimate legal arguments. His first letter to me was a masterpiece of legal theatrics, threatening everything from adverse possession claims to criminal charges for unlawful eviction of established residents. Your family has been residing at the property continuously for over 30 days, the letter stated, establishing tenancy rights under state law. Any attempt to remove them without proper legal procedures will result in criminal charges and civil litigation for damages, lost property, and emotional distress. The legal language was designed to sound authoritative, though I later learned most of his threats were baseless. Vance had also begun filing preliminary paperwork to challenge grandmother's will, claiming new evidence had emerged about her mental state during the final months. The documents suggested she'd been experiencing memory issues and confusion that the family had been too polite to acknowledge publicly. They were posthumously attacking her mental capacity to undermine the legitimacy of my inheritance. The pressure campaign extended beyond legal threats. Derek's girlfriend Monica had moved in and begun redecorating grandmother's bedroom, replacing cherished antiques with her modern furniture. When I objected, she innocently claimed Derek had told her the room needed updating for family members who'd be staying long-term. She was destroying my memories while presenting herself as helpful. Richard had reached out to my employer, expressing concern about my mental state following grandmother's death. He didn't make direct accusations, but he planted seeds of doubt about my stability and judgment during what he described as a difficult family crisis. The HR department called me in for a conversation about whether I needed additional bereavement support or time off to handle personal matters. The psychological pressure was constant and coordinated. Diane called me daily with tearful pleas about how my actions were destroying the family. She'd start each conversation expressing love and concern, then gradually shift into guilt tactics about how my selfishness was hurting everyone. "Your grandmother would be heartbroken to see what you've done to this family," she'd sob. All she ever wanted was for us to stay together. But perhaps the most insidious attack was their campaign to turn my own memories against me. They'd begun telling stories about grandmother's final months that painted me as manipulative and calculating. According to their version, I'd isolated her from family members, controlled her medications, and gradually convinced her that her other grandchildren didn't care about her. Chelsea had become particularly skilled at this type of psychological warfare. She'd share memories of conversations with grandmother where she'd supposedly expressed confusion about the will changes. She asked me why Haley was being so secretive about legal documents. Chelsea would tell relatives. I think she was starting to realize she'd been manipulated, but it was too late. By the end of that week, I felt completely surrounded. My own family had turned my inheritance into a crime scene, my grief into evidence of guilt, and my attempts to protect my property into proof of my instability. They'd created a narrative where every action I took could be interpreted as either confirming their lies or demonstrating my unreasonableness. Standing in my apartment, surrounded by threatening legal documents and evidence of their systematic campaign, I realized they'd planned this war with military precision. They weren't just trying to take my property, they were trying to destroy my credibility, my relationships, and my sense of reality itself. But their elaborate deception contained the seeds of its own destruction, and I was about to start planting those seeds. My best friend Kayla arrived that Saturday morning with a determination that matched my own and equipment I hadn't expected. As a forensic accountant who dealt with corporate fraud cases, she understood better than I did how to document systematic deception. "We're going to destroy their lies with facts," she announced, setting up her laptop and pulling out devices I'd never seen before. The first step was establishing a timeline of their actual activities versus their false narratives. Kayla had brought micro cameras that could be hidden throughout the house, motion-activated recording devices, and software that could analyze digital communications for patterns of coordination. "Your family thinks they're smart," she said with grim satisfaction, "but they're amateurs compared to the corporate criminals I've exposed." We spent the morning strategically placing recording equipment throughout the property. The cameras were virtually undetectable, hidden in picture frames, decorative objects, and even electrical outlets that Kayla had specially modified. The audio devices could pick up conversations from adjacent rooms and were designed to activate when voices reached certain decibel levels. Everything was legally positioned in common areas where there was no expectation of privacy. The digital forensics were equally important. Kayla's software could recover deleted text messages, analyze email metadata, and track social media coordination that might appear organic but was actually orchestrated. "Family conspiracies leave digital fingerprints," she explained while setting up monitoring protocols. "They think deleting messages makes them disappear, but we can recover everything." By Sunday evening, we'd already captured explosive evidence. Derek and Chelsea were recorded discussing their strategy to break Haley's spirit before moving to phase 2 of their plan. The conversation revealed details that made my skin crawl. They'd been monitoring my daily routines, tracking my work schedule, and planning escalations designed to maximize psychological pressure during my most vulnerable moments. "She's starting to crack," Derek's voice came through clearly on the hidden recording. Monica says she's been crying when she comes by to check on things. If we keep pushing, she'll sign over partial ownership just to make this stop. Chelsea's response was even more chilling. Good. I want her to remember this every time she thinks about defying family decisions. This house is just the beginning. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Derek had been selling grandmother's antiques and jewelry, thinking I wouldn't notice items disappearing from a house full of memories. Kayla's cameras captured him loading a truck with furniture that had been in our family for generations. The timestamps showed he was systematically stripping the house of valuable items while his documentation claimed he was preserving family heirlooms. The recordings revealed that Brenda had become the central coordinator of their fraud campaign. Her phone calls with various relatives showed sophisticated manipulation techniques where she'd plant false information, then follow up days later to confirm details that supported their narrative. She'd created an echo chamber where family members were unknowingly reinforcing lies they'd been fed about my behavior and motivations. I'm just so worried about Haley's mental state, Brenda's voice echoed from our hidden devices during a call with my aunt. The grief seems to have changed her completely. She's become paranoid and aggressive, nothing like the sweet girl we remember. I think losing her grandmother broke something inside her. The performance was Oscar-worthy, complete with perfectly timed pauses and manufactured emotion. Kayla's analysis of their social media activity revealed coordination that couldn't be coincidental. Posts about their displacement and my greed were timed for maximum impact, using language that had clearly been workshopped to generate sympathy while avoiding legal liability. Even their extended family members' comments appeared to follow talking points that had been distributed in advance. The most shocking discovery came when we analyzed the forged documents more closely. Using software that could detect digital manipulation, Kayla proved that several signatures had been copied from other sources and pasted onto new documents. The letter of authorization Tyler had been given contained my signature lifted from a birthday card I'd sent Derek 3 years earlier. The sophistication suggested they'd hired professional help for their document forgery. But they'd made crucial mistakes that revealed the full scope of their deception. Derek's contractor friends had been paid under the table for their work on the property, creating a financial trail that proved premeditation. Text messages between Chelsea and Derek revealed they'd started planning their invasion within days of grandmother's funeral, while publicly expressing grief and support for my loss. The evidence gathered that week painted a picture of calculated family warfare that went far beyond property disputes. They'd created fake emergencies to justify their presence, forged legal documents to establish false claims, and manipulated extended family members into unwittingly supporting their fraud. Everything they'd accused me of, they were actually doing themselves: manipulation, deception, and exploitation of family relationships for financial gain. Kayla's forensic analysis also revealed their financial motivations were more desperate than I'd realized. Derek owed significant money to contractors and suppliers, with liens already filed against his business. Chelsea was facing divorce proceedings where her husband's lawyer had frozen joint assets, leaving her financially vulnerable. Richard and Diane had refinanced their home multiple times and were approaching retirement with insufficient savings. The beach house wasn't just a valuable asset they wanted to control, it was their perceived solution to multiple financial crises. Their private communications revealed plans to use the property as collateral for loans, rent it out for significant income, or force a sale and split the proceeds. My inheritance represented their financial salvation, which explained the desperation behind their coordinated attack. But perhaps the most valuable evidence was their recorded admission of guilt. In a moment of candid conversation, Richard had told Derek, "We know we don't have legal rights to this property, but possession is 9/10 of the law. If we can establish residence and make her fight us in court, we can bleed her dry with legal fees until she gives up." The recording eliminated any pretense that their actions were justified or well-intentioned. The hidden cameras also captured their discussions about Phase 3, which involved more aggressive tactics if their current strategy failed. Chelsea had suggested filing false criminal charges, Derek proposed sabotaging my employment, and Brenda recommended spreading rumors about my mental stability throughout our social circles. They were prepared to destroy my life to get what they wanted. By the end of that week, we had accumulated over 40 hours of recorded conversations, hundreds of text messages recovered from deleted files, financial records proving fraud, and digital evidence of coordinated social media manipulation. Kayla organized everything into a comprehensive dossier that documented their conspiracy from conception to execution. "This is enough to destroy them legally and socially," Kayla announced as we reviewed the evidence collection. "They've committed fraud, forgery, theft, trespassing, and conspiracy. More importantly, we can prove they planned this entire campaign while pretending to grieve your grandmother's death." The satisfaction in her voice was matched by the cold anger in her eyes. But the evidence had also revealed something that broke my heart. They'd never loved me or respected grandmother Margaret. Their private conversations showed nothing but contempt for both of us. They'd seen my grandmother as a source of potential inheritance and me as an obstacle to claiming what they felt entitled to receive. Every family gathering, every holiday celebration, every expression of love had been performance designed to maintain access to potential wealth. As we prepared to move from defense to offense, I realized the evidence we'd gathered would do more than protect my property rights. It would expose their true nature to extended family members who'd been manipulated into supporting their lies. The recordings would reveal to relatives how they'd been used as unwitting accomplices in a campaign of fraud and emotional abuse. The most powerful weapon in our arsenal wasn't just the evidence of their crimes. It was the proof of their callous disregard for family relationships they claimed to value. When relatives heard recordings of Chelsea and Derek laughing about manipulating gullible family members and Brenda coaching Richard on how to perform grief more convincingly, the social consequences would be devastating. Looking at the mountain of evidence spread across Kayla's laptop screen, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began: confidence. They'd played a sophisticated game of family warfare, but they'd underestimated their opponent. The shy, accommodating granddaughter they'd always dismissed was about to become their worst nightmare. The family's response to my resistance escalated into psychological warfare that would have made military strategists proud. They seemed to understand that direct confrontation hadn't broken my resolve, so they shifted to tactics designed to isolate me socially and destroy my reputation within our extended family network. The family intervention they organized was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation disguised as loving concern. They'd rented space at our local community center and invited over 30 relatives, many of whom I hadn't seen since childhood. The invitation described the gathering as an emergency meeting to help Haley through her grief-induced crisis and support her in making healthy decisions about family relationships. When I arrived, the setup was clearly designed for maximum psychological impact. They'd arranged chairs in a circle with one empty seat facing the group, like some therapeutic intervention for addiction. Relatives I barely knew sat with concerned expressions, having been briefed on my supposed mental breakdown and unreasonable behavior regarding the family property. Diane had prepared for weeks, crafting a performance that would have impressed Broadway audiences. She stood before the assembled family members with tears already flowing, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine maternal anguish. "I don't know what happened to my daughter," she began, dabbing her eyes with tissues she'd strategically positioned. "Losing her grandmother seems to have broken something inside her. The sweet, generous girl we raised has become suspicious, angry, and completely unreasonable." Richard played the role of concerned father perfectly, speaking in measured tones about his deep worry for my mental state. "Grief affects people differently," he explained to the nodding relatives, "but Haley's behavior since Margaret's death has been increasingly erratic. She's accused us of terrible things, threatened legal action against family members, and refused to consider any compromise that would keep our family together." But Brenda's contribution was the most sophisticated psychological attack I'd ever witnessed. She'd positioned herself as the neutral observer, the outsider who could see the situation objectively without the emotional investment of blood relatives. "I've watched this family for 3 years now," she said with apparent reluctance, "and I've never seen anything like what's happened since Margaret passed." Haley has become paranoid, aggressive, and completely focused on money instead of family relationships. The relatives had been primed with carefully selected stories about my supposed behavior. They'd heard about my threats to call police on family members, my refusal to allow relatives to visit grandmother's house for memorial purposes, and my obsession with property values over family bonds. Each story contained just enough truth to seem credible while completely distorting the context. Chelsea had prepared photo displays showing our family's happy history at the beach house, carefully edited to emphasize times when I appeared distant or unhappy. The narrative she created suggested I'd always resented sharing grandmother's attention and had spent years planning to claim the entire inheritance for myself. She used to get so jealous when grandmother gave attention to Derek or me, Chelsea told the assembled relatives. Now we see what that jealousy was building toward. The most devastating moment came when they played edited audio recordings of my phone calls with various family members. Using sophisticated editing software, they'd created clips that made me sound hostile, unreasonable, and threatening. My attempts to understand their invasion were transformed into evidence of paranoid accusations. My requests for explanation became demands backed by legal threats. Derek's role was to provide the threat of consequences. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone reminded everyone that I was now isolated against a united family front. When he finally spoke, his words carried weight that others didn't. "I don't want to see Haley destroy herself over greed, but I won't let her destroy our family either. If she can't see reason, we'll have to protect ourselves and our children from her increasingly unstable behavior." The intervention's climax involved relatives taking turns expressing their concern and disappointment. Many genuinely believed they were helping me by encouraging me to see reason and put family first. Their words cut deep because they came from people who'd known me since childhood but had been fed a steady diet of lies about my current behavior. "Haley, honey, your grandmother loved all of us," said my elderly Aunt Dorothy, her voice shaking with age and emotion. "She wouldn't want this property to tear our family apart. Surely you can find a way to share this blessing instead of hoarding it for yourself." The guilt was designed to be overwhelming, especially coming from relatives who genuinely cared about grandmother Margaret. But the most cruel psychological tactic was their decision to invite my ex-boyfriend Marcus to several family gatherings. They'd painted him as a concerned friend who could provide outside perspective on my behavior, while actually using him to amplify their narrative about my mental instability. Marcus, who'd remained friendly since our amicable breakup 2 years earlier, had been told I was struggling with grief-induced paranoia and needed support from people who cared about me. "She's been calling me with these wild theories about her family stealing property," Marcus confided to relatives at one gathering, unknowingly reinforcing their false narrative. "I'm really worried about her mental state. She's not the rational, calm person I remember." His genuine concern was being weaponized against me, turning my attempts to seek support into evidence of my instability. The social media campaign intensified with surgical precision. Every family gathering they hosted was documented and shared, showing relatives enjoying themselves at the family beach house while I was notably absent. The photos were captioned with subtle implications about my choice to isolate myself rather than participate in family healing activities. Chelsea had become particularly skilled at generating sympathy through social media manipulation. Her posts about toxic family dynamics and choosing peace over conflict resonated with friends who didn't understand the full context. She shared inspirational quotes about forgiveness and family loyalty that indirectly criticized my position while maintaining plausible deniability. The psychological pressure extended beyond family relationships into my professional life. Richard had reached out to colleagues and industry contacts, expressing concern about my emotional state and judgment during this difficult period. He never made direct accusations, but he planted seeds of doubt about my reliability and stability that began affecting my business relationships. They'd also begun filing strategic restraining order requests, claiming harassment and threatening behavior. The orders were designed to be denied due to lack of evidence, but the legal filings created public records that suggested ongoing conflict and instability. Each filing reinforced their narrative that I was the aggressor in an escalating family dispute. Derek's girlfriend Monica had escalated her redecorating campaign, systematically replacing grandmother's furnishings with her own modern style. When I discovered she donated several antique pieces to charity without permission, Monica innocently claimed she was updating the space to make it more comfortable for family visits. She was erasing my memories while presenting herself as improving the family property. The physical intimidation became more sophisticated as well. Tyler had been coached to block my access to certain areas of the property while maintaining plausible excuses about ongoing maintenance or family meetings that required privacy. His presence alone was intimidating. He stood 6'4" and had the build of someone who'd spent years in construction work. But perhaps the most insidious psychological tactic was their campaign to rewrite family history. They began sharing memories of grandmother Margaret that portrayed her as someone who valued family unity above individual preferences. According to their revised narrative, she'd been increasingly concerned about my isolation from family activities and had expressed worries about my selfish tendencies in her final months. She told me she hoped the house would bring the family together, not tear us apart, Diane would say with apparent sadness. I think she'd be heartbroken to see what Haley has done with her generous gift. The lie was particularly cruel because it attacked both my inheritance and my relationship with the person who'd loved me most. By the end of that month, the psychological pressure had become a constant weight on my shoulders. Every family gathering I wasn't invited to was photographed and shared. Every relative I hadn't spoken to was contacted with concerned updates about my behavior. Every professional interaction was shadowed by whispered concerns about my stability. They'd created a reality where my attempts to protect my legitimate property rights were evidence of mental breakdown, where my resistance to their fraud was proof of family disloyalty, and where my grief over losing grandmother was transformed into a convenient explanation for my unreasonable behavior. Standing alone in my apartment, surrounded by legal documents and evidence of their systematic campaign, I realized they'd successfully isolated me from most of our extended family. The people who'd watched me grow up now viewed me as the villain in a tragic story of grief-induced family destruction. The psychological warfare had been devastatingly effective, but they'd made one crucial miscalculation. Their campaign had revealed the true nature of their characters to someone who'd been documenting everything, me. The recordings Kayla and I had gathered showed them laughing about the relatives they were manipulating, joking about the fake tears Diane could produce on command, and celebrating their success in turning family members against me. The evidence we'd collected would soon turn their psychological weapons against them, exposing their manipulation to the very people they'd convinced to support their cause. The family members who'd been used as unwitting accomplices were about to learn how their genuine concern had been exploited for financial gain. Faced with my continued resistance and growing legal documentation of their fraud, my family made their most desperate and manipulative play yet. They understood that their previous tactics hadn't broken my resolve, so they shifted to strategies designed to generate maximum public sympathy while painting me as a heartless monster who would deny aid to family members in genuine crisis. The medical emergency campaign began on a Tuesday morning when Diane called me at work, her voice filled with panic that sounded genuinely terrifying. "Haley, I need you to come to the hospital immediately. I'm having chest pains, and the doctors are running tests for a possible heart attack. The stress of this family situation has been too much for my heart." The call was designed to trigger my guilt and fear while providing cover for their next phase of manipulation. I rushed to the emergency room to find Diane surrounded by concerned family members, connected to monitors and looking appropriately fragile. Richard sat beside her bed holding her hand with the expression of a devoted husband facing potential tragedy. Chelsea paced the waiting area with tears streaming down her face, while Derek stood with his arms crossed, shooting accusatory looks that made their position clear. This was my fault. "The doctor says stress can trigger these episodes," Richard explained with the weary tone of someone bearing an enormous burden. "All this conflict over the house has been devastating for your mother. She lies awake at night worrying about our family falling apart. His words were carefully chosen to suggest that resolving the property dispute was literally a matter of life and death. But the true manipulation became clear when Diane, speaking in a weak voice that required everyone to lean in close, made her request. "Sweetheart, I need to know our family has a safe place to stay while I recover. The doctors say I need a stable, peaceful environment without financial stress. Please, just let us use the beach house temporarily while I get better. Don't let family pride kill your mother." The emotional blackmail was expertly crafted. Denying a heart attack victim's request for temporary shelter would make me appear ruthlessly selfish. The hospital staff, who'd been told we were a loving family facing a crisis caused by property disputes, looked at me with expectation that I would obviously do the right thing for my sick mother. Chelsea had prepared backup documentation that looked impressively official. She produced medical forms that supposedly required Diane to have stable housing with minimal stress factors during her recovery period. The documents recommended familiar surroundings with family support and specifically mentioned that displacement or housing insecurity could severely compromise the patient's cardiac recovery. Derek's contribution was to provide specifics about their supposed housing crisis. According to his carefully crafted story, they'd been staying with various relatives since I'd kicked them out of the beach house, moving from place to place without the stability Diane needed for her health. "She needs her own space to recover properly," he explained to the gathered medical staff. "Hotels are too stressful, and we can't keep imposing on other family members indefinitely." But the medical emergency was just the opening move in their sophisticated campaign of manufactured crises. 2 days after Diane's convenient heart episode, Derek produced documentation claiming his non-existent child needed the beach house for specialized therapy sessions that could only be conducted in a familiar, stable environment. The child in question was supposedly his girlfriend Monica's daughter from a previous relationship, a 7-year-old girl named Emma who allegedly suffered from severe anxiety disorders requiring specific therapeutic interventions. Derek had obtained forged documents from what appeared to be medical professionals, recommending familiar residential therapy settings for treating childhood trauma responses. "Emma has been through so much with her parents' divorce," Derek explained to anyone who would listen, including neighbors and potential allies. "The stability of staying in the family beach house has been crucial for her therapy progress. If we have to disrupt her treatment because of Haley's legal threats, it could set back months of healing." The fabrication was particularly insidious because it involved an innocent child and manufactured mental health crises that couldn't be easily disproven. Brenda had escalated her own medical manipulation campaign by producing documentation suggesting she was battling early-stage breast cancer that required low-stress living conditions during treatment. The forged medical reports recommended avoiding family conflict and housing instability that could compromise her immune system during chemotherapy. Her performance as a brave cancer patient fighting for family unity was Academy Award worthy. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Brenda would tell anyone who listened, her voice trembling with apparent courage. "I just need a peaceful place to focus on beating this disease. The beach house has always been where our family finds healing." I can't understand why Haley would deny that sanctuary to someone fighting for their life. The emotional manipulation was devastating because it combined medical crisis with family legacy and personal sacrifice. The manufactured emergencies were supported by an elaborate network of forged documentation that included fake medical records, fraudulent therapy recommendations, and fabricated financial hardship reports. They'd created an entire narrative of family medical crises that supposedly required the specific environment and resources of the beach house for proper resolution. Richard had coordinated media manipulation designed to amplify their medical emergency narrative. Local news stations received carefully crafted press releases about a heartless family dispute where property greed was preventing sick family members from accessing necessary recovery environments. The coverage painted me as a wealthy property owner denying shelter to relatives facing life-threatening medical conditions. But their most desperate play involved staging a fake break-in designed to prove that the house wasn't secure under my ownership. Derek used his contractor connections to create evidence of forced entry that would support claims about property vulnerability and the need for family security measures that only their continued presence could provide. The staged break-in was sophisticated enough to fool initial police investigations. Windows were broken from the outside, valuables were strategically disturbed, and evidence was planted to suggest random criminal activity rather than family involvement. Derek then used the incident to argue that the house needed constant family occupation to prevent future security breaches. "This proves Haley can't properly protect the family property," Chelsea announced in social media posts about the fake break-in. "Grandmother's house is being destroyed under her management while she refuses to let family members who actually care about the property provide proper security. The incident was used to support their narrative about my incompetence as a property owner." The media manipulation campaign intensified with strategic leaks about the family emergency housing crisis that painted their situation in the most sympathetic possible terms. Local newspapers received anonymous tips about a daughter denying shelter to sick parents, while social media influencers were fed stories about property inheritance disputes that were literally threatening lives. Tyler had been coached to provide independent confirmation of the medical emergencies to anyone who inquired about the family situation. His role was to appear as an unbiased relative who'd witnessed the health crises firsthand and could vouch for the legitimacy of their desperate need for stable housing during medical treatment. Extended family members received detailed updates about each manufactured crisis, complete with photos from hospital visits, copies of forged medical documents, and emotional appeals for support during the family's darkest hour. Many relatives who'd been skeptical of earlier manipulation became genuinely concerned about the apparent medical emergencies. But their most audacious move was organizing a family emergency meeting that was actually an intervention designed to pressure me into signing legal documents while family members were presumably dying or severely ill. The meeting was presented as a last desperate attempt to resolve property issues before medical crises became fatal. "We're running out of time," Richard announced to the assembled relatives with dramatic urgency. "Diane's heart condition is worsening under the stress. Brenda's cancer treatment requires immediate stability, and Derek's child is regressing in her therapy progress. We need Haley to put aside her property disputes and help her family before someone dies from this conflict." The pressure was designed to be overwhelming, deny assistance and potentially cause family deaths, or submit to their demands and save multiple lives. Every relative in attendance had been primed to see me as the sole person standing between sick family members and the medical stability they needed for survival. The manufactured medical crises were supported by fake GoFundMe campaigns that raised money for medical emergencies exacerbated by family housing disputes. The campaigns generated genuine donations from sympathetic community members who believed they were helping sick people denied shelter by a greedy relative. But they'd made crucial mistakes in their desperate fabrication campaign. The medical documentation contained inconsistencies that forensic analysis would later expose. The staged break-in left evidence of inside knowledge that only family members could possess. The timing of multiple medical emergencies was statistically implausible and emotionally manipulative in ways that exceeded the bounds of credibility. Their desperation had driven them to tactics so extreme that they'd crossed legal lines involving insurance fraud, medical document forgery, and false police reports. Each fabricated crisis created evidence trails that would later expose the systematic nature of their deception campaign. Standing in that hospital room, surrounded by fake medical emergencies and manufactured family crises, I realized they'd escalated beyond property disputes into elaborate criminal fraud. Their willingness to fake medical conditions and exploit genuine community sympathy revealed the true depths of their moral bankruptcy. The evidence we'd been gathering had captured their planning discussions for each manufactured crisis, including conversations where they laughed about stupid community members donating money to their fake medical campaigns and relatives who fell for the heart attack performance completely. Their desperate power play was about to become their complete downfall, but not in the way they'd planned. The very desperation that had driven them to such extreme tactics would soon provide the evidence needed to destroy them legally, socially, and financially. The discovery that shattered every remaining illusion about my family's motivations came through a source I never could have anticipated. Mrs. Patterson, our elderly neighbor who'd been unknowingly helping their invasion, called me late one Thursday evening with information that would change everything I thought I understood about their conspiracy. "Haley, dear, I think I've made a terrible mistake." Mrs. Patterson's voice wavered with guilt and confusion. "I've been cleaning out my late husband's office, and I found something that doesn't make sense. There are papers here with your parents' names from last spring, months before your grandmother passed away. They were asking about property values and inheritance laws while Margaret was still healthy and living independently." My blood turned to ice as Mrs. Patterson continued. "The documents show they'd been researching how to challenge wills and establish property rights even before Margaret became seriously ill. I thought they were just concerned about estate planning, but now I realize they were planning something else entirely. They knew exactly what they were going to do before your grandmother ever died." I drove to Mrs. Patterson's house immediately, my hands shaking as she led me to her husband's old law office. Harold Patterson had been a retired attorney who'd occasionally helped neighbors with simple legal questions, and my parents had apparently consulted him under the pretense of concerned family members wanting to understand inheritance procedures. The documents were devastating. Richard and Diane had visited Harold Patterson multiple times during the spring, asking detailed questions about will contests, adverse possession laws, and strategies for challenging estate distributions. The notes showed they'd been particularly interested in establishing family residence rights and creating documentation that could support claims of shared property ownership. But the most damning evidence was a series of consultations where they discussed problem-solving strategies for situations where elderly family members might leave property to individual beneficiaries rather than distributing assets equally among children. Harold's notes indicated they'd been specifically concerned about grandmother Margaret's favoritism toward me and wanted to understand their options if she didn't include them in her will. "Your father asked very specific questions about how long someone needed to occupy a property to establish residency claims," Mrs. Patterson read from her husband's notes with growing horror. "He wanted to know about utility transfers, address changes, and documentation that would prove continuous residence. This was in April, 3 months before your grandmother's final illness." The timeline revealed the true scope of their premeditation. While I'd been caring for grandmother during her final months, they'd been consulting lawyers about how to steal whatever inheritance she might leave me. Every family gathering, every expression of concern for her health, every moment of supposed grief had been performance designed to maintain access while they planned their property seizure. Harold's notes also revealed that Brenda had been the strategic mastermind behind much of their planning. She'd researched property law extensively and had developed the systematic approach they'd used to document false residency claims. Her background in insurance adjusting had given her expertise in creating fraudulent documentation that would be difficult to challenge through normal legal channels. But the most heartbreaking discovery was evidence that they'd attempted to manipulate grandmother Margaret during her final illness. Harold's notes referenced conversations where Richard and Diane had expressed frustration that she wasn't responding appropriately to their suggestions about changing her will to include equal distribution among all grandchildren. They seemed upset that Margaret was maintaining her original estate plan despite their encouragement to reconsider, Mrs. Patterson read from notes dated just weeks before grandmother's death. "Your father mentioned that she'd become stubborn about family property and wasn't listening to reasonable suggestions about shared inheritance arrangements." The investigation Harold had conducted at their request revealed the full extent of their financial desperation. Derek owed over $200,000 to various creditors, with his construction business facing bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for unpaid worker compensation claims. Chelsea was involved in divorce proceedings where her husband had discovered hidden debts and undisclosed assets, leading to fraud accusations that could result in criminal charges. Richard and Diane's financial situation was equally desperate. They'd refinanced their home multiple times, using equity to cover Derek's business debts and Chelsea's legal expenses. Their retirement savings had been depleted through a series of poor investment decisions and family bailout loans that were never repaid. The beach house inheritance represented their only chance to avoid financial ruin in their elderly years. But Brenda's motivations were the most calculated and chilling. She'd married Richard specifically because of his potential inheritance prospects, having researched the family's assets through public records before beginning their relationship. Her 3-year marriage had been a long-term investment strategy designed to position her for claiming partial ownership of any inherited properties. The documentation revealed that she'd been systematically poisoning Richard's relationship with me since their marriage began, gradually convincing him that I was manipulative and undeserving of grandmother's special attention. Her insurance background had made her expert at building false narratives supported by manufactured evidence and strategic witness manipulation. Harold's notes included his legal advice warning them that their proposed strategies were potentially criminal and would likely fail in court. He'd specifically cautioned against document forgery, false residency claims, and coordinated family manipulation campaigns. His written warnings showed they'd been explicitly told their plans constituted fraud, but had chosen to proceed anyway. The most devastating revelation was their recorded discussion about my mental stability and their plans to use my grief against me. Harold's notes referenced conversations where they discussed strategies for making me appear emotionally unstable and legally incompetent to manage inherited property. They specifically asked about procedures for challenging someone's mental capacity to inherit property. Mrs. Patterson read with visible disgust. Your stepmother suggested that grief-induced depression might provide grounds for claiming you were unfit to manage substantial assets. They were planning to use your love for your grandmother as evidence of your instability. But their planning had revealed the ultimate truth about their relationship with grandmother Margaret. Their private conversations, documented in Harold's notes, showed nothing but contempt for her and frustration with her independent decisions about her own property. They'd seen her as an obstacle to their financial goals rather than a beloved family member deserving respect and care. The financial investigation Harold had conducted showed they'd been monitoring grandmother's assets for years, tracking property values and estimating inheritance distributions based on various scenarios. They'd calculated exactly how much money they could obtain through different strategies, treating her death as a business opportunity rather than a family loss. The documentation proved they'd never intended to share the property or maintain family relationships. Their true plan had been to force a sale through legal pressure and divide the proceeds according to their own financial needs. My inheritance was just the first target in a larger strategy to liquidate family assets for their personal benefit. Mrs. Patterson's discovery also revealed why their medical emergency tactics had seemed so sophisticated. Brenda had used her insurance experience to research which medical conditions would generate maximum sympathy while being difficult to verify quickly. Her fake cancer diagnosis and Diane's manufactured heart problems were strategically chosen to create urgent timeframes that would pressure me into quick decisions. The evidence showed they'd been planning their psychological warfare campaign since before grandmother's death, with specific strategies for isolating me from family support and creating social pressure for compliance with their demands. Every manipulation tactic they'd used had been researched and planned in advance. Reading through Harold's detailed notes about their consultations, I realized that every moment of family interaction since grandmother's death had been calculated performance designed to support their property seizure plan. Their grief had been fake, their concern had been manipulation, and their family loyalty had been a strategic cover for systematic fraud. But they'd made one crucial error that would prove to be their complete downfall. Their consultations with Harold Patterson had created a detailed legal record of their premeditation, their knowledge that their actions were potentially criminal, and their deliberate decision to proceed with fraud despite explicit warnings about the legal consequences. The elderly attorney's meticulous note-taking had documented their entire conspiracy from conception to planning to execution. Every strategy they'd employed, every lie they'd told, And every manipulation they'd attempted had been discussed in consultations that created privileged but discoverable legal records. Standing in Mrs. Patterson's living room, holding documents that proved my family's systematic betrayal had begun before grandmother even died, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The grief and confusion that had plagued me since this nightmare began were replaced by cold, determined clarity. They hadn't just stolen my property, they'd desecrated my grandmother's memory and perverted my grief for their financial gain. Every tear I'd shed, every moment of guilt I'd felt, every doubt about my own actions had been the result of their calculated manipulation campaign. But their elaborate deception had created the very evidence that would destroy them completely. Harold Patterson's legal consultation records would prove premeditation that would elevate their crimes from simple fraud to felony conspiracy. Their own words, recorded by a meticulous attorney, would become the foundation for criminal charges that could result in significant prison time. The breaking point hadn't broken me, it had revealed the truth that would set me free and send them to prison where they belonged. Armed with Harold Patterson's devastating documentation and months of evidence gathered through Kayla's surveillance operation, I was ready to deploy what I privately called the nuclear option. This wouldn't be a simple property dispute resolution. This would be total legal and social warfare designed to destroy their credibility, their freedom, and their ability to ever threaten anyone else's inheritance. Harrison Walsh, the attorney I'd retained for property defense, smiled with genuine admiration as he reviewed our evidence compilation. "Haley, I've been practicing law for 25 years, and I've never seen documentation this comprehensive for a family fraud conspiracy. Your family didn't just commit crimes, they documented their entire criminal enterprise and provided us with everything we need to destroy them in court and put them in prison." Our legal counterattack began at dawn on a Monday morning with simultaneous filings that would overwhelm their ability to respond effectively. The strategy was to hit them with so many legal challenges across multiple jurisdictions that their resources would be immediately depleted and their coordination would collapse under pressure. The criminal complaints were filed first. Felony fraud charges against Derek for forged documents and false utility transfers, criminal conspiracy charges against Richard and Diane for their systematic property invasion, wire fraud charges against Brenda for her social media manipulation campaigns, and theft charges against Chelsea for selling grandmother's antiques without permission. Each family member faced multiple felony counts that could result in decades of prison time. Simultaneously, civil lawsuits were filed for property damage, emotional distress, defamation, conversion of personal property, and civil conspiracy. The financial damages we claimed exceeded $3 million, including treble damages under fraud statutes that would multiply any judgment significantly. Their personal assets would be frozen pending resolution of the civil claims. But the truly devastating blow was the federal charges we'd convinced prosecutors to file. Their coordinated use of mail, internet, and telephone communications to execute their fraud conspiracy had created federal jurisdiction for wire fraud and mail fraud prosecutions. Federal charges meant they'd face federal prison time with no possibility of state parole considerations. The media strategy was equally comprehensive and far more immediately destructive than the legal proceedings. Kayla had prepared a social media campaign that would expose their fraud to every person who'd been manipulated by their false narratives. The evidence packages included audio recordings, financial documents, and legal consultation records that proved every aspect of their deception. The first social media posts went live at exactly 8 a.m., time to hit morning commute social media browsing when engagement would be maximized. The posts included audio clips of Derek and Chelsea laughing about stupid relatives who'd believed their medical emergency stories, recordings of Brenda coaching Richard on how to perform grief more convincingly, and documentation proving their property invasion had been planned since before grandmother's death. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Extended family members who'd been manipulated into supporting their cause heard recordings of themselves being mocked and dismissed as gullible idiots who'd fallen for obvious manipulation tactics. The relatives who genuinely believed they were helping family members in medical crisis learned they'd been exploited by fake cancer diagnoses and manufactured heart attacks. Facebook groups that had been supporting their family emergency housing needs turned into platforms for outraged community members demanding criminal prosecution. The GoFundMe campaigns that had raised money for their fake medical emergencies were reported for fraud, triggering automatic investigations and refund procedures for donators who'd been deceived. Local news stations received comprehensive evidence packages that included everything from forged medical documents to recorded confessions of their systematic fraud. The coverage was extensive and ruthless, particularly focusing on how they'd exploited community sympathy through fake cancer diagnoses and manufactured child therapy needs. But the most satisfying destruction came from the extended family members who'd been used as unwitting accomplices in their manipulation campaign. Cousin Tyler, who genuinely believed I'd invited him to stay at the house, publicly shared audio recordings where Derek and Chelsea mocked him as too stupid to realize we're using him, and discussed how they'd played the pity card perfectly to manipulate his sympathy. Aunt Dorothy, whose emotional intervention speech had been designed to break my resolve through guilt, learned that her words had been strategically solicited after Chelsea spent weeks feeding her false information about my supposed greed and mental instability. The recordings revealed how they'd coached family members to deliver specific emotional appeals while mocking their genuine concern behind closed doors. The law enforcement response was swift and coordinated across multiple jurisdictions. Derek was arrested at his construction site in front of his employees and contractors, creating professional embarrassment that immediately destroyed his business relationships. Chelsea was taken into custody at her divorce proceeding, adding criminal charges to her already complicated legal situation. Richard and Diane were arrested at their home during a family gathering they'd organized to plan their next phase of manipulation. The timing was deliberately chosen to maximize their humiliation in front of relatives who'd supported their fraud campaign. Brenda was arrested at work, where her insurance industry colleagues learned about her sophisticated document forgery and fraud expertise. The property recovery operation resembled a military exercise in its precision and scope. Court orders authorized immediate removal of all family members and their belongings from the beach house, with sheriff's deputies supervising the eviction to prevent destruction of evidence or property damage during their departure. Tyler and the other extended family members who'd been manipulated into staying at the house were given 24 hours to remove their belongings while expressing genuine apologies for their unknowing participation in the property theft. Their cooperation and obvious victimization by the conspiracy protected them from criminal charges while reinforcing how extensively the fraud had spread. The security system Derek had installed was completely replaced with equipment he couldn't access or monitor. New locks were installed throughout the property, and surveillance equipment was upgraded to prevent any future invasion attempts. Legal restraining orders prohibited all family members from approaching the property or contacting me directly. But the most devastating consequence was the social destruction that followed their criminal exposure. Every friend, relative, and community member who'd been manipulated by their false narratives learned how their sympathy had been exploited for financial gain. The recordings of family members mocking their supporters destroyed relationships that had been built over decades. The financial investigation revealed the full scope of their desperation and fraud. Derek's construction business was immediately shut down by state authorities investigating worker compensation fraud and tax evasion. Chelsea's divorce proceedings accelerated toward complete asset forfeiture as her criminal charges made any settlement negotiations impossible. Richard and Diane faced foreclosure on their home as legal fees and criminal defense costs depleted their remaining resources. Their retirement savings were frozen by court order pending resolution of civil damage claims that exceeded their net worth significantly. Brenda's insurance industry career was permanently destroyed by criminal fraud convictions that would prevent any future employment in financial services. The extended family consequences were equally severe. Relatives who donated money to their fake medical GoFundMe campaigns filed additional fraud complaints seeking restitution. Community members who'd provided free services based on sympathy for their fake emergencies demanded compensation for goods and services obtained through deception. Local businesses that had extended credit or provided services based on their fabricated financial hardship stories filed collection lawsuits and criminal complaints. The web of fraud had spread so extensively that criminal prosecutors were discovering new victims and charges weekly. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the complete exposure of their true characters to people who genuinely cared about them. Harold Patterson's legal consultation notes were read publicly during criminal proceedings, revealing how they'd mocked grandmother Margaret's memory and planned to exploit her death for financial gain while publicly performing grief and respect. The recordings of their private conversations destroyed any remaining sympathy from family members who'd initially supported their cause. Extended relatives heard them discussing which family members were too stupid to see through their manipulation and which could be easily guilt-tripped into providing support for their false narratives. 6 months after the nuclear option was deployed, their lives had been completely destroyed in ways they never could have anticipated when they began their property invasion. Derek was serving 18 months in federal prison and faced additional state charges upon release. Chelsea was serving concurrent sentences for multiple fraud convictions and would emerge from prison to bankruptcy and social isolation. Richard and Diane had lost their home, their savings, and most of their extended family relationships. The medical emergency fraud had been particularly damaging to their social standing, as community members felt personally betrayed by their exploitation of genuine health concerns for financial manipulation. Brenda faced the longest prison sentence due to her leadership role in the conspiracy and her professional expertise in insurance fraud. Her systematic document forgery and social media manipulation campaigns had created federal charges that would keep her imprisoned for over 3 years. The beach house was finally mine to enjoy in peace, but more importantly, grandmother Margaret's memory had been vindicated against their attacks. The property had been restored to its original condition, with their modern intrusions removed and her beloved antiques returned from the various places Derek had sold them. Standing on the deck overlooking the ocean, I realized that their nuclear attack on my inheritance had backfired completely. Their systematic fraud had created the evidence needed to send them to prison. Their manipulation had exposed their true characters to everyone they'd deceived, and their desperation had resulted in consequences far more severe than simple property loss. The nuclear option hadn't just protected my inheritance. It had protected future victims from their sophisticated fraud techniques and manipulation campaigns. Their criminal convictions would serve as permanent warnings about the consequences of exploiting family relationships for financial gain. 6 months after the legal devastation of my family's criminal conspiracy, I find myself sitting on the restored deck of grandmother Margaret's beach house, watching the same sunset she'd shown me countless times during those healing childhood summers. The view hasn't changed, but everything else has been transformed by the truth that finally emerged from their elaborate web of deception and manipulation. The legal victories were complete and comprehensive beyond anything Harrison Walsh had initially projected. Derek received an 18-month federal sentence, followed by 3 years of state prison time for his construction fraud schemes that investigators discovered during his property invasion prosecution. His business license was permanently revoked, and civil judgments ensure he'll be paying restitution for the next 20 years. Chelsea's divorce proceedings concluded with complete asset forfeiture after her criminal convictions made any negotiated settlement impossible. Her social media manipulation expertise, which she'd used so effectively against me, became evidence that convinced prosecutors she was a sophisticated fraud specialist deserving maximum sentences. She'll emerge from prison to a world where her reputation has been permanently destroyed by her own recorded words, mocking the people who'd tried to help her. Richard and Diane lost everything they'd spent their lifetime building in their desperate attempt to steal my inheritance. Their home was foreclosed, their retirement savings were seized to pay civil judgments, and their relationship with extended family members was permanently severed by recordings revealing their contempt for relatives they'd manipulated. They're spending their final years in subsidized housing, supported by public assistance programs they'd previously criticized. But Brenda faced the most severe consequences due to her role as the criminal mastermind whose insurance industry expertise had enabled their sophisticated document forgery and manipulation campaigns. Her federal sentences totaled over 4 years, and her professional credentials were permanently revoked across multiple states. The woman who'd married my father to gain access to family wealth ended their marriage imprisoned and bankrupt. The financial recovery exceeded even my attorney's optimistic projections. Civil judgments forced them to repay not only the money they'd stolen through utility transfers and property sales, but treble damages under fraud statutes that multiplied the restitution significantly. Even the GoFundMe donations they'd obtained through fake medical emergencies had to be repaid with interest and penalties. More importantly, the community response validated every difficult decision I'd made during their systematic attack on my inheritance and reputation. Family members who'd been manipulated into supporting their false narratives publicly apologized for their unwitting participation in the fraud conspiracy. Extended relatives who'd criticized my resistance to family sharing learned how their genuine concern had been exploited by criminal manipulation tactics. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband's legal consultation records had provided the evidence that destroyed their defense strategy, became an unexpected ally and friend. "Your grandmother would be so proud of how you fought for her memory and her wishes," she told me last month. "Margaret always said you had the strongest backbone in the family, even when you were just a little girl who seemed quiet and accommodating." The healing process began with reclaiming every space in the house that had been violated by their presence. Derek's girlfriend's modern furniture was removed and replaced with antiques I'd rescued from the various places he'd sold them. Grandmother's bedroom was restored exactly as she'd kept it, complete with the hand-quilted bedspread she'd made during my childhood summers. But the deeper healing came from understanding that their betrayal had revealed truths about family relationships that I'd been too naive or hopeful to acknowledge before. The recordings of their private conversations showed that their contempt for me and grandmother Margaret had existed for years before her death. Every family gathering, every holiday celebration, every expression of love had been performance designed to maintain access to potential inheritance wealth. The most liberating realization was that losing their false love wasn't actually a loss at all. The people who genuinely cared about me, like Kayla and Mrs. Patterson, had remained loyal and supportive throughout the crisis. The extended family members who'd been manipulated into supporting the fraud conspiracy had apologized and rebuilt relationships based on truth rather than manipulation. I've started hosting gatherings for the family members who stood by me and the relatives who'd been deceived, but responded with integrity when they learned the truth. Last weekend, we had a memorial service for grandmother Margaret that honored her actual values and wishes rather than the false narrative my parents had created about her supposed desire for family unity over individual preferences. The beach house has become a sanctuary not just for me, but for family members and friends who understand the difference between genuine love and manipulative performance. Kayla brings her children here for summer vacations, and Mrs. Patterson joins me for evening walks along the shoreline where grandmother and I used to collect shells and talk about life's complexities. Professional therapy helped me understand that the guilt and self-doubt I'd experienced during their campaign weren't evidence of my weakness, but normal responses to sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to exploit my capacity for empathy and family loyalty. Learning to recognize manipulation tactics has protected me from future exploitation while preserving my ability to trust people who deserve that trust. The legal victory established precedents that attorneys use to protect other inheritance beneficiaries facing similar family fraud campaigns. Harrison Walsh has written articles about the case for legal journals, emphasizing how comprehensive evidence gathering and coordinated legal strategy can overcome even sophisticated family manipulation conspiracies. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome has been discovering my own strength and capacity for strategic thinking under extreme pressure. The person who'd been dismissed as the quiet, accommodating granddaughter had successfully coordinated a legal and social campaign that sent career criminals to federal prison and recovered assets they'd believed were untouchable. The business relationships that Richard had attempted to damage through his concern about my mental stability were actually strengthened when colleagues learned how I'd handled systematic family fraud with intelligence and determination. Several clients have referred new business specifically because they were impressed by my capacity for strategic thinking and problem-solving under pressure. Looking back, I realized that Grandmother Margaret's decision to leave me the beach house wasn't just about property inheritance. It was about trusting me to protect family values against people who would exploit them for personal gain. She'd recognized something in me that I hadn't seen in myself. The strength to stand alone against manipulation, and the wisdom to distinguish between genuine love and calculating performance. The ocean view that's remained constant throughout this transformation reminds me that some things endure beyond human manipulation and greed. Grandmother's love was real, her trust in me was justified, and her decision to protect what mattered most was vindicated by events she could never have fully anticipated. As autumn approaches and I prepare for my first peaceful winter in the house that's truly mine, I've learned that protecting your inheritance sometimes means protecting your soul from people who've never understood the difference between love and ownership. The family members who genuinely cared about relationships rather than assets have remained part of my life, while those who saw me as an obstacle to their financial goals are facing the consequences of their criminal choices. The greatest lesson from this experience isn't about legal strategy or evidence gathering, though those skills proved invaluable. It's about trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, refusing to accept guilt for other people's manipulative behavior, and understanding that sometimes protecting what matters most requires disappointing people who never truly loved you anyway. Sitting here as the sun sets over the Atlantic Ocean, I feel the peace that comes from knowing I honored Grandmother Margaret's trust and protected her legacy against people who would have destroyed it for temporary financial gain. The beach house remains a sanctuary for healing and growth, just as she'd intended, free from the toxic presence of people who confused love with leverage and family loyalty with financial opportunity. The story of their systematic fraud and criminal conviction serves as a warning to other families about the potential consequences of inheritance disputes, but for me, it represents something more hopeful. The discovery that standing up for truth and justice, even against family members, can lead to authentic relationships and genuine peace. What would you do if your own family tried to steal your inheritance through fraud and manipulation? Have you ever had to choose between family harmony and protecting what's rightfully yours? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if you believe people should fight for their rights even when the battle is against their own relatives. Subscribe for more true stories about family betrayal and justice, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update about standing up to manipulation and fraud. Share this story with anyone who might be facing similar family pressure to give up their rightful inheritance. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for genuine family relationships is refusing to enable the behavior of people who exploit love for personal gain. Thank you for joining me on this journey from victimization to victory. Remember that protecting what your loved ones entrusted to you isn't selfishness, it's honoring their memory and their wishes. Until next time, stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that love requires accepting abuse or fraud. Sometimes the greatest act of family loyalty is protecting the family legacy from family members who would destroy it, and sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are actually the ones who understand love the least.